when they contact, typically committees now will respond if they're interested in you at all with a questionnaire. And they'll ask you to answer these questions. Now, my suggestion to you is that you answer the questions with short, truthful statements. Short, truthful statements are the way to go. You don't try and be exhaustive. Don't try and answer more than they're asking, and don't say everything you could possibly say about their question. So, and also I would tell you to look sort of behind the question and ask yourself what they're looking to find out, because sometimes they use buzzwords. And like if they ask, you can expect you're going to get the Calvinism question. A lot of them have been poisoned against it by some local DOM or something. Make sure if you get one of those Southern guys, you got to make sure you question about Calvinism. Now look, I would tell you, never be deceptive, but I also know that a lot of times these committees don't even know what Calvinism is. So typically, like in a live interview, if they ask you the C word, I would respond by saying, could you tell me what you mean by that? Put it back on them so they define it for you. Shockingly, they will usually say something that very few Calvinists believe. A lot of the time they'll come back with really hyper-Calvinism, like you believe you're against missions because you think that only the elect can be saved. Some are chosen for heaven and some are chosen from hell. Well, that's not my view. So I can say, well, no, I don't believe that. And what I always try and do is answer their fear. So what's their fear? Their fear is you're going to get rid of missions. You're not going to be strong in the gospel. You're going to be divisive. You don't believe whosoever will may come. Well, in my answer, I'm going to go right after every one of those fears. Even if they ask in such a way that I feel permission to tell them, yeah, I have a high view of God's sovereignty. The Bible is clear. It uses the word election, so we can't deny election is real. But the question is, does this keep anybody who wants salvation from having salvation? And my answer to that is absolutely not. I believe that whosoever will may come. I believe that I can make a bona fide offer of salvation to every person on this planet. If you will repent and believe, you will be saved. And I just put it that way. So I think, and I also, every church I've pastored, I made a promise that I then kept. And that is that this church will be more evangelistic under me than you've ever been. And I intend to lead the way with personal evangelism and an emphasis on the gospel. And you will never think that because of my view of election that somehow we're not offering salvation to everybody. We're going to go after every lost person in our community, and we're going to try and see them come to faith in Jesus Christ and be baptized and become disciples and followers of His. And I just say it that way. I just, well, yeah, I believe this, but here's how this works out. So be prepared for that, whether in writing or in person. Now, typically, a lot of times they're going to want to just get together with you and talk to you. Let me give you one piece of advice, that if you made it to the top of the pile of the resumes, this is going to get you to the top of the pile of the candidates they meet. And it's a simple thing. Memorize and use their names. It's just huge. If you go into that meeting, even if you pull out your pen and a piece of paper and write them down, and they see you write them down, that still says you care enough to write down their names so you can learn their names. Now, is it more impressive if you don't have to write it down? It is, but trust me, it's still a good thing if you write them down. And I remember my first meeting with the Buck Run Search Committee. I can tell you the order that they sat in around the table, and I can call each of their names. And I made it my goal that night to learn and to use each of their names multiple times, and I did that. It's almost like an unfair advantage. I mean, they're drawn to a guy that uses their names. And yet, I'm shocked that so few people will do this. So when you meet with them, learn their names and use their names when you answer their questions. Now, they'll typically come in and they'll have questions for you. They'll have the standard questions, like you'll get the Calvinist question if you're from Southern. They'll ask about your work history and that kind of thing. But when they ask you questions, listen carefully, because they're going to ask questions that say something about the past of the church. If you get like these outlier questions that make no sense, it could be something that's really shocking to you, a little bit like, well, what do you think about Mexicans? You know, now, if they ask a question like that, you know something's happened, right? That's a red flag that says, okay, something's happened with, Hispanics in the community, and they've had some issue. And again, if they ask anything like that, don't hesitate to say, can you explain to me what you mean? And typically, when you give them a little bit of leeway, they'll go into it. But you want to draw out from them what it is, what's behind their question. Answer all their questions honestly, candidly, but with short, truthful statements. Don't just keep talking. Answer it as succinctly as you can in a way that sort of does away with their fear or alleviates any concerns, but don't just keep talking. And at the end of it all, you ultimately should have more questions than they do. So they'll ask you questions, answer them, but then it's your turn. Let me tell you what not to do first. Don't bring up money. Money is way down the line. Don't talk about money. We'll get there. But here's what I've got: a series of questions that I think you should ask, and I'll share them with you now. But it's the way you ask them that matters as much as anything. And that is, you've got to go around the table. Pick out the person that you think is the least verbal. And let's say it's Kathy. Kathy's on that committee and she's not talked much. And say, well, I want to ask a question and I'd like each of you to answer. And I'm going to start with Kathy and we'll just go around the room. And I'd like to hear each one of you tell me your perspective. Kathy, what do you think will be your next pastor's greatest opportunity just waiting to be seized? All right, now, listen to the way I said that question and what all you get out of that. First of all, notice I put it in the third person. What would be your next pastor's? I didn't say what would be my. That's presumptuous. Sounds arrogant. Let's talk about your next pastor. It may not be me. Maybe somebody else. So this keeps you from sounding needy and grabby, and it also makes them not feel awkward. So she's not talking about you. She's talking about this indefinite person who will be their next pastor. And you're asking a positive question. What will be your next pastor's greatest opportunity just waiting to be seized? So what is it that's out there that your church can do? Hadn't been done yet. This is opportunity, just a big low-hanging fruit waiting for somebody to pluck it. What do you think? Kathy will tell you her idea. But this is going to provoke thought in all the rest of them. And you go to the next person, I guarantee you, if you've got 8 members on that committee, you're going to get probably 5 or 6 different opinions. A couple of them will agree. Oh, I agree with what Kathy said. But mostly, they're all going to have a different thing. No, what Kathy says is a great opportunity, but I think the greatest would be, and they'll tell their opinion. Now, if you're listening carefully and you're watching their body language and interaction, you'll also see that little fissures between them sort of surface. They're not hostile, but they clearly got different opinions and attitudes about what the church needs to do. So you ask that when you go around the room. They each answer it. Then, okay, let me ask you another one. What do you think will be your next pastor's greatest challenge or obstacle that might get in the way of progress? Okay, you loosen them up on that first question. It was positive. Now they're going to get into the stuff. You know what? When I asked this question of the Buck Run Committee, when I got to Robert Curry, the chairman, in fact, I think he just spoke up and said it before anybody else could answer. He said, well, I can tell you what the next pastor's greatest challenge will be. It's that your name's not Bob Jackson. He's not a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but he nailed that one. That was exactly my greatest challenge. My name was not Bob Jackson. I had people come in my office on multiple occasions and say, you know, we like you. You're probably the best preacher we've ever had. But, you know, when it comes to being a pastor, you're just no Bob Jackson. They said it over and over and over. And I learned just to plead guilty to that one. I just said, I aspire to be as great a pastor as Bob Jackson. I pray the Lord one day will let me be as great a pastor as Bob Jackson. Now, deep in my heart, you know, did it hurt? A little, not much. By the time I got to Buck Run, I wasn't a novice at this, and I knew that the day will come. They're going to look somebody else in the eye and they go, you know, we like you. You're all right. You're no Herschel York. That's going to happen. It's just what happens when you're somewhere a long time. Because they get used to you. And while they're getting a new normal, there's a part of them that looks wistfully back at the old normal, and they remember stuff nostalgically. They don't remember the bad stuff. You know, you sort of rub around the edges. I mean, I've seen it many times at funerals, haven't you? I've seen couples that couldn't get along at all when they were married, and one of them dies, and the other one's standing there at the coffin just like weeping. I don't know what I'm going to do without him. I'm like, well, man, you didn't know what to do with him when you were married. And it's like that in the church. That, you know, once you're dead and gone, whatever, they look nostalgically back at the tenure because you were the devil they knew. The devil they don't know is always a little bit stranger. So listen to what they tell you when they say they know the greatest challenge, because it's likely to be true. It probably will be. But again, hearing the differences of their opinions, if several of them say, you know, the biggest challenge is going to be growing at all, because we're just so stuck in our ways. It's like, if a new family comes, I don't know what, you know, we don't know what to do with them. We're not a welcoming place. Okay, that's a big one. And that tells you what you're going to be up against. So listen to their answers to this real carefully, and ask them if, like, once they get serious with you, ask them to have a copy of certain documents. Now, you don't ask this up front. This is on into the process. So you need a copy of the church constitution and bylaws if they have them, current budget. Southern Baptist churches are supposed to fill out a thing called the annual church profile. And it gives all their stats. And if they've done that, you want a copy of that. It tells you how many they have in attendance, how many they have in Sunday school, how many are enrolled in Sunday school, how much they give to missions, to the cooperative program, to Lottie Moon, Annie Armstrong, everything. Great Commission giving. That tells the tale of a church. I mean, it does. It'll tell you you get a lot about the church health from that document. You want a statement, you want a copy of their budget. You want a copy of, if you're going as senior pastor. Now, if you're not going as senior pastor, you probably don't want to ask for this. It'll seem presumptuous. But you do want to know how much indebtedness they have. And if they have adopted any long-range plans. So when I went to Buck Run, they were $3 million in debt. They already had bought 100 acres of property for a relocation, and they had adopted a plan for a $14 million building. Now, you just do the math. They were running just over 500. 500 people can't spend $17 million and get out of that hole. I knew day one I was going to have to be the guy that told them there's no Santa Claus. And that was hard. No, we can't build that building. In fact, we can't build yet at all. And for the first 10 years I was at Buck Run, one of the biggest complaints about me was I had no faith. I mean, I had people come in my office and say that. I had one old guy finally went around me and said, well, I want to meet with the deacons. I trusted my deacons enough that I gave him the meeting. I let him have the meeting. He was like, you know, we need to do something. We need to go on and build. We need to do something. He had a plan. He thought he could get us out there, and I just need to step out in faith, and if everybody would do this. Now, this guy's heart was in the right place, and he was a wonderful, godly man who had done an awful lot in our church. But I knew, you know, I'm not going to lead us into that level of debt. We're going to get out of debt first, and then we're going to get at least $1 million in the bank before we do anything. And he went to the deacons. So I told the deacons, he wants to talk to you. I let him have his thing. He got up and gave his plan of what we needed to do with that property and how we could get there and get this thing going. And the deacons listened carefully. They asked insightful, probing questions. And then they told him we want 3 weeks to work on this, study this. We're going to appoint a subcommittee to consider this, and we'll give you our answer. Now, I want you to know, I was totally at peace and at ease the whole time. I was never worried about what they were going to do. And you know what? 3 weeks later, here was their answer. He said, we've reached 2 conclusions. One is, we as a deacon fellowship, we make a recommendation to the deacon fellowship that we never, ever let this happen again. That no one may come around the pastor to make a request of us. Boom. So I was pretty sure the second recommendation was going to be pretty good after I heard the first one. They said, the second one is we say no to this. We don't think the timing is right yet. Buddy, when you got deacons that do that, they're trustworthy, godly, good men. And I was never in doubt about it. I knew going in to Buck Run that kind of thing was going to be happening by the questions I asked, by the way that I saw the long-range plans they had adopted. Bob had, because they'd had this phenomenal growth in the 90s and outgrew their facilities so quickly. Even when they built a new building across the road, went to 2 services fast. You know, Tom Rayner writes this in Eating the Elephant about Buck Run, articles in newspapers about them. They become a church growth study model. Bob just thought, there's no end to this. We're going to be able to afford a $14 million building. When Bob himself saw he wasn't going to be able to pull that off, that's when he resigned. But he never said publicly, that's why. He didn't say, I've misled you. He said, I need to get out of the way so somebody else can come in and do that. Which didn't really help me. You understand? It just moved the burden off of him onto me. So I had to be the guy to come in and say, no, we can't do that. They had spent $100,000 on plans that I then came in and said, we're throwing them away. That was hard. That was a hard thing to do. But nothing surprised me because of the search process. That's what my point here, I'm telling you all this is because I learned all this. I saw all this coming through the search process when I asked those questions. greatest opportunity, greatest obstacle. I got those documents. I talked to the committee. I listened to their concerns. Now, you've also got to ask doctrinal stuff if you suspect there's something amiss, something awry. And I did. I asked, those things. There was stuff I didn't cover, I didn't know to ask, and didn't discover till I got there. We talked about the Calvinism thing. I gave them my assurances, and by that point, it was 2003. I had a track record. You could look at Ashland Avenue, you could look at First Baptist Marion, you could see both those churches grew exponentially while I was there. In fact, I'll tell you, Buck Run has grown less under my pastor than any of the other two. It's been a harder place to grow than Lexington or Marion, Arkansas. But I had a track record I could point to and say, now look, you can see my Calvinism didn't get in the way of growth there at all, nor have I made it the hallmark of my ministry. I believe it, but it's not the flag I fly. And I'm comfortable with other views. They got okay with that. It became not an issue. But all that was worked out by transparent and honest conversation with the committee at the beginning. The doctrinal stuff that I encountered once I got there that I didn't know to ask about, I asked them about communion. I knew they had open communion, and I told them, I'm going to teach other than that. And they said, as long as you teach us and explain why, we'll follow you. But when I got there, I discovered they had this thing called silent communion. On Christmas Eve, they just put the elements out in the sanctuary, and anybody wanted to stop by with their family and serve themselves communion could do so. Lost people, anybody. And I found that out like 2 weeks before we did it. I had to decide how to handle that, and what I did was I told the deacons, I disagree with this, but I realized I don't have time to teach on this first year. We're going to do it this year. I'm not going to have anything to do with it, but between now and next Christmas, I'm going to teach why that's wrong, and this will be our last time. And the deacon said, we think you're wise for both things. Don't try and force that on people now without explaining why. But if you show us from the Scripture why that's wrong, we'll follow you. And they did. The other thing that I discovered was they really had a soft charismaticism in the church. A lot of words of knowledge, healing in the atonement. They pray over people. We know that Jesus died so this person wouldn't have cancer. By his stripes were healed. I encountered that. There's stuff you're going to learn that you don't find out in the process, but you want to find out everything you can in that search process.